Here we go. All right. Meeting is now streaming. This is a good start.
Well done, Glenn.
I had one thing to do tonight. Start the live stream. So one thing that I'm not sure is from staff, is it Zlatko or is it Deborah, or I'm just not sure who's leading it, who we should be handing things off to from a staff perspective tonight.
That'll be myself, Zlatko.
Zlatko, all right, perfect, thank you. I'm going to make sure that everyone can share screens in case we need that. That's all good. And I'm letting folks in here who are part of the transportation team and counselor team, but we're coming up on 6:30. So I will lead things off with a hello today, and then hand it over to each of my council colleagues to say a quick welcome, and then we'll pass it over to Zlatko for the presentation and see how we go from there with questions and comments and so on from people on the call. And there's a whole bunch of people in the waiting room. So with one fell stroke, I can admit all and let everybody in. Is everybody ready to go? I think we're already on Facebook, so this will be letting in our Zoom audience too. All right, here we go. All right, we've got a whole bunch of people logging on, connecting to audio. We'll give folks a couple more minutes just to join before we start our official program here tonight. And I'll also ask that everybody make sure you're muted.
There's a video, there's one.
Spell your name.
6:30 p.m. Okay, so we'll start in just a minute or two.
That's great setup. By email.
This is great. We've got a ton of people joining, and this is going out through Facebook too. So I'm sure lots of people watching on Facebook. We're just going to wait another minute or so and give people a chance to connect to the Zoom, and then we'll start. All right, I'm going to hit the record button so we have this for posterity. There we go. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Councillor Glenn Gower. I represent Stittsville Ward, and I want to welcome everyone to our Q&A tonight about active transportation. And we're going to be talking about some of the missing links for the sidewalks and pathway networks in Stittsville, in West Carleton, and in Canada North and Canada South. I have a number of my council colleagues here with me who we'll introduce in just a moment, and some of our city staff here as well who work as part of the transportation department, undergoing a really major project, the update of the transportation master plan, and as part of that, the update of the active transportation plan. So we're going to hear all about that today. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to residents who've already sent their feedback about missing links, and to just say I'm really glad we've done this as a joint meeting with all of the West End councillors, because a lot of the feedback that I've seen, isn't limited in my case to people in Stittsville. I mean, obviously, if you live in Stittsville, you travel to Carp to go to Alice's, or perhaps you travel down the Trans-Canada Trail through Canada South, or you cross the highway, maybe you're headed to work in Canada North from Stittsville, and we have these connections in all different parts of our ward. So I'm really glad that we're able to do this as a joint meeting tonight, because it's really important to think about how all of our communities are connected. So we're going to start with some introductions, and we'll start with just a quick hello and introduction from Councillor Hubley in Canada South. Hi, Alan.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this. I just want to say how much I appreciate everybody's input into this process so far. The ideas and suggestions have been great. We also appreciate the emails we receive with suggestions as well. And we're ready to talk about the various links between our communities as you suggested. So thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Councillor El Shantiri. Hi, Eli.
Hi, Glenn, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight. This is a very good meeting. I'm hoping, and I'm to be honest with you, I was happy and relieved to see some engagement from my community about the cycles, and it's not just the connectivity, but also from car driving, looking for safety for both cyclists and car traffic and pedestrians. So we're here to listen to our resident, and I'm looking forward for a staff presentation and the Q&A. So I hope you'll stay with us for the meeting. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks, Eli. And Councillor Suds. Hi, Jenna.
Hi, thank you, Glenn, and good evening, everyone. My name's Jenna Suds. I'm the councillor for Canada North. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. It's great to see so many faces, some familiar, some not, for this important discussion. I think we're very lucky in our respective communities here in the West End to have some great both cycling infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, but certainly look forward to hearing your ideas of how we can make that even better, safer, easier. So really thankful for everyone's input tonight and ongoing, of course, and happy to have staff here to help guide us through this discussion tonight. So my thanks.
All right, thanks, Jenna. Now I'm going to hand things over to Zlatko from our city staff in a moment, but I just want to invite anyone who's watching the call tonight on Facebook or on YouTube or here on Zoom, wherever you're tuning in. You can use the chat or the comments to share any comments that you might have. If you have questions and you're on Zoom, you can also use the chat. We'll try to watch Facebook as well, and if there's as questions come in, we'll try to direct those after the presentation to city staff or maybe ourselves as councillors. But I already see there's a couple comments coming in on Zoom, so a good start already. Zlatko, I'll turn it over to you to introduce your team, the team that's here, and let you take it away. You are on mute, Zlatko.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'm very happy to be here tonight. We've done this already a couple of times. And so I think the feedback that we've received is people have appreciated the conversation, getting up to speed, hearing what other people think, And you're very correct. It's very good to talk about this in multiple wards since people don't only cycle in their own wards, obviously. So in terms of introducing the other staff that are on the call, first of all, my name is Zlatko Kristalic, and I'm the program manager for active transportation planning. So it's part of the team that, broadly speaking, is working on the transportation master plan update. And with me on the planning team, we have Sam Roberts and Laura Hagerman. And so they'll be keeping an eye on the chat on the side. But in addition, we also have Phil Landry, who's a director of traffic services. And many of the comments and questions have to do with safety and those kinds of issues. And we're very glad that Phil could join us. Phil, I'm not sure if you wanted to add any thoughts at this point.
Thanks, Zlatko. I just wanted to say hi to everybody, and I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation and the feedback.
Yes, and so I'll share some slides and we'll go over these questions to bring the discussion. I find what works really well in the past is that as people put questions up in the chat and so on, if counselors can maybe grab a couple they think are interesting, please join in. Because if for my sake, if no one else's, I don't want to be just speaking for, into the mic. It's good to have that interaction, and the extra questions are really helpful. I may also ask some questions, and if I won't necessarily be able to follow the chat, if someone can sort of relay to me, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So I will see if I can share my screen.
Looks good. Sharing screen looks good.
All right. So first of all, just to give you a little bit of a overall picture of where we are in this particular active transportation plan update, I think it's helpful to look back a little bit in history for the last two plans. First of all, the very first plan we had in the amalgamated city was 2008 and 9. And I would call it an aspirational plan because it talked about all the things we could and should do, but it really didn't have the budget lined up to implement those things. So it just sort of said, this would be great to do all these things. It was really in 2013 that the PED and the cycling plan, which are still in force, by the way, they haven't yet been superseded. That also brought in the discipline of projecting a bunch of projects we're going to do up to 2031. And to the best of our ability, we assumed that we could get them done for the budget that was projected in our long-term financial plan. So it was bounded by the resources we expected to have, and that's a really important step in planning. And the budgets were much more significant than they were previous to, say, 2010. A lot of new policies were brought in, and some of them people question, well, what really will complete streets do, or multimodal level of service? But I have seen a dramatic change in how we're treating these balancing acts of what we do with roads compared with what it was 10 years ago. So I do believe they've been effective. So now we're at the point where we're ready to update these plans. The timeline is going to be 2023 when we expect to have them all fully approved. But nevertheless, we're going to make a big step this fall where we're going to present what we think the package of projects is going to be for a 10-year period from 2024 to 2034. So that's 10 years after the plan's approved. And we're going to look at a bucket of projects that's bigger than our projected long-term financial plan to give us headroom in case additional funding comes available, which we have seen in the past through things like federal stimulus, et cetera. Within that process, we have already done an engagement previously on some of the principles, and in fall, we went out, many of you may have participated, where we asked you to put push pins in across the city to talk about problem areas and so on. And so the next step, as I mentioned in phase 3, is going to be to put a map up with what we're proposing as projects, and then I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback on that. This is an example of the push pins I was mentioning from the earlier consultation, where people were flagging problem areas. Now, this is by no means the only thing that we look at, but it's helpful to sort of double check where there's problem areas defined to make sure we've looked at them and understood what the comments were. And in fact, oftentimes there's more specific text within each push pin. So even as we get to implementation, we'll be referring back to some of these comments. The hard part, I believe, in this plan is not going to be to find excellent and worthy projects. It's going to be to come to a common decision as to what the priorities are that we're going to work on in the next term of the next plan. And so what we're doing tonight is something that I think is important, because it's going to help inform the councillors in terms of what recommendations they're going to put into us for their own priorities. And that's not the only thing we look at, but we obviously want to make sure that we've looked at the councillor priorities very, very seriously before we come up with our final list. And that is, of course, subject to review as well. We certainly don't want to be surprised that we missed a councillor priority without any explanation. Over the last 10 years, we've had a lot of progress made in continuity of facilities. The next step is going to be in quality. So if you look at our crosstown bikeway network, in many ways, it's intended to be something called a minimum grid. And this idea of looking at what corridors we need to have and focus on in the future is something we're going to continue with in the next plan. And in many cases, once we've established basic connectivity, we are continuing to add higher quality facilities along these corridors. Here's just mentioning some of the things that are either done or in process that were recently done in the areas that we're going to be talking about. So just to say that we have been also active in the wards in the West. So moving on to some of the questions, these were all forwarded to us and we received them through the councillor's office. So we're going to try to do our best in providing answers. So in terms of developments, there's maybe two classes of development. We obviously do, particularly out in the edges of the urban area, we do new greenfield subdivisions, and all those subdivisions are reviewed. And we have a new philosophy in terms of making sure all collectors and certainly arterials have cycling facilities, and all local roads will have at least one sidewalk, and no matter what the speed of the road is. And in addition, when we are putting facilities along major arterials, we're not going to put a bike lane on the side of the road. We're going to put a bike track off the road and have a sidewalk as well if and where warranted. So every single project, no matter the size, is reviewed. If it's got some frontage where we are worried about active transportation, and many, many changes and improvements have been made on those submissions. A question on e-scooters and e-bikes. We have just put together a bylaw for e-scooters. We are working with the e-scooter vendors to find ways, some technical, to eliminate or at least reduce dramatically sidewalk scootering. And so generally we have permissive rules, and we're seeing more players join in Ottawa, and the territory is expanding. In terms of e-bikes, we don't have any particular e-bike sharing system, but e-bikes are in fact allowed on most cycling facilities. However, two things are outstanding. The Ontario government is just coming together with defining new standards for e-bike types. And so we have to incorporate that within our bylaws, as well as updating some of our parks bylaws, which regulate usage on mostly on many multi-use pathways. So there's a question about what do we do when we resurface or rebuild roadways, and do we consider active transportation? In fact, a large part of the new facilities that we bring in are in fact done through either resurfacing or rebuild or reconstruction of roadways. If you look at the example of Lion Street, it was actually the first project I worked on about 10 years ago. And I remember it was brought up by a resident after the road was resurfaced, asking, can you please put in bike lanes? Now that won't happen these days, because every resurfacing is reviewed in advance to see if we can add facilities. And in addition to that, we also increase buffering and try to reduce travel lanes over the years, so that you'll see that even if there's a bike lane on a roadway, after resurfacing, it will often be improved in terms of quality. And when we're rebuilding a roadway, of course, we have many examples where there's been a very big transformation, and oftentimes bike tracks can be put in, or at least bike lanes, depending on the circumstances. In terms of rural villages, the way that the policies in the new bike plan are going to be applied to rural villages, there's really no distinction from other local roads or collector roads in the city. So all those policies will apply within the rural villages. And there's also policies like 15-minute neighborhoods, where, for villages that have a certain core area and services, we want to definitely increase connectivity. And that is going to be played out within the new active transportation plan. So if there are projects suggested in villages, we're certainly interested in looking at them, and they will be considered along with all other projects. There's a question about what sort of bicycle riders is the city actually planning for? And oftentimes it's a question of, are you going to make facilities that will accommodate people that generally are afraid to use on-road facilities and mixed traffic today? And the answer is very much yes. Mainly it's because we cannot actually grow the cycling cycling modal share dramatically unless we make it comfortable for all those other users to join in. So if you look at the image on the left here, it's this was, I think, Fisher and Dines, and it gives you the sense of where we're heading. It'll take some time to complete all these facilities. But a facility that you're looking at with a protected intersection, protected and buffered bike tracks, we believe that people of all ages and abilities will be very comfortable in using that. And it does keep you as safe for moving traffic and separated as we can make it. There are guidance that is provided, and it's slightly different in rural and urban contexts, just because of the land use and the type of roadway design in rural areas is very different, and there may very well be a difference in the kind of users that are prepared to do these long distance rural trips. But nevertheless, this is the guidance that's the sort of most up to date that we're seeing from a design guide called Book 18 for those people that are aware of it. There's a question put forward about paved shoulders, and this is also similar to the conditions on roadways in the city, where the edge of the road, whether there's a curb or not, often is more deteriorated than the surface that the vehicles are traveling on. We're not quite there yet in terms of having a separate quality metric and tracking the quality of that road edge distinctly from the rest of the road. However, our asset management team is interested in that problem because it is a quality of service factor. So that's something that we may add on to the new pilots and policies we look at. And we have to not only decide a roadway edge is bad, but we have to find a reasonable way to fix it that isn't worse than the original problem. So I think that's one that could be considered going forward. Well, this is a question if someone can check in the chat, but I wasn't entirely sure what was meant by rural cleared paths. I mean, obviously there are pathways in rural villages, and if they're a pedestrian facility that provides something like a 400-meter shortcut relative to any other paved sidewalk, they would be considered in scope for plowing. So if anyone can add more sort of context to that question, I'd be happy to say more. We're also updating the winter maintenance quality standards, which has been a continual area of complaint, particularly for pedestrians. And so there is a contact there. Laura maybe can tweet that email address. So if you have specific comments about the methodology, how we should be managing maintenance. Maybe there's some roads or some sidewalks that get more than you think are needed and some that get less. Now is an opportunity to add that comment. So was there anyone that can comment on anything about the rural cleared paths, if there are any specific examples? Otherwise, I'll move on.
I'm not sure though, it's Councillor Al-Shanti. I'm not sure when we talk about rural path, like we have some of them inside the village of Car, and they are mostly pedestrian and they are plowed the same time we do the sidewalk in the village of Car. So I'm not sure, are they talking about other pathway outside the village? We don't plow them if it's outside the village boundary.
Yeah, so perhaps in the chat someone can comment and we could follow up if they have more to add. Another question was about the challenges of adding sidewalks to existing, let's say, local streets, and it is truly challenging. The challenges include, we often have mature trees, which we are very, very reluctant to remove, obviously. We have to worry when we take some city right of way and people's driveways are affected. But the biggest technical problem is drainage. And so it actually doesn't just include ditches, but there's also other multiple drainage challenges when you add curbs. And so we found a number of different techniques. For example, sometimes we can add a drain behind the sidewalk that goes into a ditch further on. Occasionally we'll have a pedestrian facility that's protected with rumble strips if there's no other option in terms of dealing with drainage. And sometimes we'll put a multi-use pathway behind the ditch, which provides a facility for both cyclists and pedestrians. In addition, we can provide swales that can cross drain the road into a ditch behind it. So we're putting together with our consultants some techniques and so on that give us some flexibility, but there will be cases where we just simply can't put a facility in where drainage is there's just no solution to it. A question about pathways and hydro corridors. I would say we do use hydro corridors very, very heavily for our pathway network. And in my experience, at least recently, Hydro One has been fairly cooperative in allowing for it. They're the ones that use most of these, most of these major corridors. But there are some major caveats. We do find historically very often pathways cross roadways without any kind of crossing control or not an appropriate one. And it leads to major safety issues. It's hard to fix. So I think the caveat would be it's not just the corridor, because the hydro wires can jump over an arterial without any trouble, but not the users. I don't know, Phil, if you had anything to comment about that. I mean, you've seen many examples of these crossings.
Yeah, and so we're working, there's a lot of existing locations, especially out in the suburbs where I think this example would be out in Orleans, the one with the PXOs. So we're installing PXOs where possible. At the busier intersections, like there's one on Eagleston there at the Trans-Canada Trail. There on arterials we have to use traffic lights. So we do look at that as well. But we're also, as part of subdivision and new developments, we're getting the developers to install those at the time of construction so that everything's ready and set to go when people start to move in. And we also look, I know there was a picture there out in Carp by the Carp Fair grounds. I know I worked closely with Councillor Shanturi a few years ago to get that installed. And I think that's been very successful. So we look at all opportunities and we just need to get feedback from you who live there to see where are the pinch points and see what we can do to try to address those.
Phil, when you just said Eagleston at Trans-Canada Trail, do you mean this picture here, which is Terry Fox at the Trans-Canada Trail?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question about bike parking LRT stations. We have definitely been expanding dramatically bike parking at stations from stage one scenarios. I've seen 2 or 3 times as much parking being provisioned for stage 2, but in addition, there's also room to grow. So that's built into the contract. There has to be space to expand parking. But there's also other city groups that have been adding parking. OC Transpo, for example, has just launched Bike Secure, which is, well, it's actually the second time we've attempted to have a secure public parking where you sign up and you get a access permit and you lock up your bike at a station. So that's just opened up recently. Of course, in these times, it's not heavily used, but as conditions improve, that'll be a great way. If you're commuting with your bike, say to a station, and you want to leave it there during the day, then this is a great option. We do plan to integrate repair stations at many of these stops. Over on the bottom right, you'll see that we've just finished, it's not quite open, a pathway to a station at Surville Road, which is, first of all, adding a low stress route to a station from residential areas. But second of all, we've added really quite a lot of parking spaces for bikes here to encourage that mode. So the bottom line is we are definitely expanding secured and unsecured parking options dramatically. And I'm sure as you come and see the new LRT stations over the next year or two coming together, you'll notice that, I'm sure. So there were, I think, two questions blended into this one, and I would sort of answer them, have a couple of answers for each one. We'll start off with this question of floating bike lanes. So for example, this one, I think it's the St. Patrick Bridge. It used to have 250 meters of a bike lane where you would have traffic on both sides. And depending on traffic conditions, you could easily have people rush by you on the right, even faster than the traffic on the left. So this was very uncomfortable for most people. We made a deliberate design change, including a safe jug handle, to allow this bike lane to go up against the curb. And when you do that, you also have to solve the challenge of the right turn hook. And so there's a bunch of interventions here to make that safe by slowing turning movements, improving the sight lines during the conflict point. And I would say it's been very successful. And we had a lot of debate. This is one of the first ones we did, just to convince all kinds of cyclists that this was worth the trade-off, that you sometimes lose convenience by doing this. The second way we'll eliminate floating bike lanes is as we add protected intersections, it means that we can also take the cyclist off the roadway, and instead of having them float beside the right turn channel and then come into the area, it's sort of almost a second ring for bikes to do both straight through and turn movements. And so in this particular example, I think this is Donald Street at St. Laurent, we eliminated 75 meters of floating. It was not even a bike lane, it was a shared lane. Now, these protected intersections, they're coming to many, many locations across the city. I think we have over 40 of them in design, maybe even more now. And so that's going to be part of the strategy. Phil, I don't know if you had any comments about the protected intersections, but I think that this is definitely a strong direction. We're seeing it in all kinds of projects.
Yeah, no, I think that's where we're going from the city design perspective. Like Zlatko says here, especially where you had channelized right turns, where you see a lot of those type of intersections in the suburbs, by putting in the protected right turn and removing those conflicts, which in the big picture improves safety because there's less conflicts, and where the vehicles make the turns, they're doing so at a lot slower speeds. So we are moving forward with those, and any new intersection gets designed that's got a cycling facility approaching to it, you would expect to see that type of design.
It's also useful to note that these are considered much more safe for pedestrians as well. In fact, this particular project was driven primarily as a pedestrian safety project. The other question is, why do bike lanes disappear at intersections? It's because whatever right-of-way or curb-to-curb space you have on the straightaway, usually at intersections, you're adding turn lanes, and so you use up the right-of-way, and often those lanes are dropped off. Now, we don't do that anymore on new facilities, and we have come back, for example, in this case in Canada, and we've added an off-road facility, which is a bike track, to more or less make up for the fact that the paved shoulder ends here, and there was no other way but a sort of mixed traffic route to travel further. And so in this particular case, we provided multiple connectivity through the intersection, which is fully protected. So the first question is, I mentioned we're going to be putting together a project list for a 10-year period, and we're spending a lot of time looking at every project and doing a lot of outreach. During the period of when that plan is in place, we generally have not seen major changes to those plans. And I'm speaking here on our experience of the last 10 years with the 2013 plans. Sometimes we skipped over some projects for various reasons for coordination. In the pedestrian project, we did have pushback on some projects, which we set aside. but generally we didn't really open it up for new ideas, if you will. That being said, there were a number of special programs that were either funded by council, like strategic initiatives, or funded by our federal and provincial partners that kind of opened up special programs where new projects were considered. And finally, there's an awful lot of places now where new cycling pedestrian facilities get added outside of these plans, like road rebuilds, resurfacing, safety projects. Phil's team also has their own set of projects which are tied to safety, which may address people's concerns. In terms of percentage of budget, it's obviously it depends on what big envelope you want to talk about. So I thought it was maybe best to just share the experience from the last plan in 2013 that was approved. And these figures are in, I think, 2013 dollars, and they are intended to run out to 2031. So it gives you a sense, there's no surprise that LRT spending trumps all the others. And I would say over the last 10 years, we have probably matched these numbers that were planned to be spent over 20, thanks to additional funding. But then again, the LRT costs came in much higher than expected. So as we start talking about this question again, about spending in buckets, which will be in the next couple of years, not now, these numbers will be reviewed again in the context of the Transportation Master Plan. So in terms of funding drastically increases, I think the way we're approaching that is by allowing more projects to be identified and sort of below the line basis, so that if more money does come, we won't have to scramble and sort of look for other lists. We'll have an idea of what we would spend additional resources on. This question on what's the strategy in terms of the core cycling routes? And I would turn once again to the Crosstown Bikeway Network that we identified in 2013. In many cases here, the connectivity, I would say, is at a basic level. However, we are intending to improve it. So for example, if you look through Canada, in some cases, we're using multi-use pathway links to make up a route. And we would, because they're a part of our major route, we would reach out to asset management and ask that those be prioritized for widening and upgrading, as well as looking at crossings and so on to make these routes much more effective. Now, that being said, this applies to the whole city. We are now looking at new corridors, and if this route network for these core networks needs to be denser, then we can add additional routes if there's a good, strong justification for it. Perhaps in this case, maybe Carling needs to be looked at. Across the city, particularly after amalgamation, there were, I would say, different approaches to how cycling facilities were added. And so some of that legacy remains in the sense that roadways that have what look like are bike lanes on them, they're painted lines. You'll notice there's no triangles and bike symbols and signs. And the other big fact, I would say, besides those extra features being missing, is that parking is allowed, or let's say at least it's no parking and not no stopping as you would in a normal cycling facility. So our approach is to try to reconcile that by just taking roadways where parking is actually not only allowed, but does happen, and just making sure that our mapping reflects that fact. And then where a roadway really should be part of a cycling network, it needs to be identified as a project, because removing parking on these roadways does require consultation, and there's a lot of people that are impacted by it. So we have to go through a process. On some of the more arterials, where really there is no parking, we can usually clean that up whenever we resurface a roadway and just get it up to standard in terms of all the necessary markings. This particular location, many of you will be familiar with it. It's along Carling Avenue. It's close to the mini putt and the entrance to the Canadian Communications Research site. So the challenge is an old structure that's very narrow, and what happens is it generates actually two problems. One is that this quite heavily used cycling corridor, it's a very wide paved shoulder, is constrained, and cyclists have to get in front of traffic that's typically going at very high speeds, get through signal 5. But secondly, there's a fairly well-used pathway network, NCC network, and the challenge is crossing Carling without any signalized facilities at Burke. And so both these problems, I think, are very, very obvious, and they have been made clear as being issues to me by the councillors. And so we're going to look at that and come up with a feasibility study on what we can do to solve these problems within the next plan. So we certainly would hope to come up with significant improvements. The question about getting between Carp and Goleta side road. So the current plan is to run a paved shoulder around the outside of edge, if you will, of the ward. Now, this green line is sort of an aspirational one, depending on what happens with this particular rail corridor. So it's certainly not in the near term, but in the update to our plan, because this was all based on 2013 guidance and planning, we are going to be considering a much more direct route. And so this is the sort of thing we're keen to get some input on, and it applies to the whole rural area. This is our chance to adjust it. If you look at the existing route, if you look at the different colors, when it's sort of the lighter yellow, this means there's a paved shoulder in place. And the darker color means that we plan to put one in next time there's a resurfacing. So certainly very keen to get some input on that. We often don't get as much feedback on the rural networks as we would like to. And the investment is fairly significant in the paved shoulders. I wasn't 100% sure what was intended by certainly the comment here, control of cycling in West Carleton. I'm going to assume sometimes we've heard complaints about cyclists riding multiple abreast in the rural areas. And we do often hear comments of why don't we require cyclists to be licensed? Now that second question on licensing is something that we did address and looked at pretty deeply. It was an official request made by a councillor in 2011. And so we've come to the conclusion it's just not worth the effort in terms of cost and staff time to pursue that particular path. I don't know, Phil, if you could comment on other issues and problems that you may have heard along the lines of perhaps people cycling abreast. I know it's more a police matter, but I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that. And also on the education element.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to the cycling abreast. I mean, you sort of see that on the weekends, and I mean, a lot of times the cyclists use the roads. They tend to use the lower volume type roads. In terms of awareness, we also I oversee the Safe Roads Ottawa program, which has an awareness component in terms of cycling. So we do try to get out, and unfortunately with COVID, like a lot of our work is actually going out to the community and meeting with people at fairs and out in the rural areas, and also going to meetings at schools and things like that. But with COVID, we've had to tail that back. So we do have that program, and if there's any specific areas or subjects that you'd like us to look at from an awareness perspective, we do awareness campaigns citywide, but if there's a focus, we do work with counselors if there's specific issues as well that we can provide information and get that out. Just let us know, and we'll work with you to get the message out.
The active transportation plan, we never had a specific policy about lighting. We're going to look at that, whether we need one. It comes up very often, especially when we talk about routes to transit. Nevertheless, each project we do ask the question, and often where we are trying to provide safe 24-hour access, particularly to transit, we have added lighting along pathways. So it's quite expensive. So it's not something we do broadly, but it's absolutely considered in each case. The other question was about signage. So we do sign across town bikeways. There's some specialized neighborhood routes that have been signed. And occasionally we'll put bike route signs. It's not as common as we would have done in the past, but we certainly are pushing out our mapping on all kinds of electronic open map standards, because increasingly that's the way people figure out what routes they want to take. And it's also a very good way to share some sort of tourism day trip sort of ideas, particularly in the rural areas. And so we did do a project that was very successful, and we have a bunch of routes all over the city, actually, that we do encourage not only our residents, but beyond that to pursue. And thanks, by the way, Councillor Hubley, I think you helped us quite a bit on that one, as I recall. So this particular question, what is a process for selecting the locations? We do have a process where our consultants are looking at all the policies and missing links and desire lines to come up with some suggestions. Staff also, through years of experience and reading comments we've received previously, do have an opinion of where some good projects would be. And also we're going to be reaching out to the councillors. So we have the direct feedback in the fall, the historical feedback, the ground up study by consultants, as well as the councillor priorities that we'll be looking at. The second part has selected some very, very tough areas in terms of projects that would be very expensive to do. And there's also challenges with right of way and so on. So I would say that the key, the absolute key is to come to some conclusion on really where the focus is, where the absolute key links are when we're talking about some of these major corridors. And we may start off by doing a feasibility study where it's just too much of a leap to just draw a line and assume somehow we'll figure it out. So, I mean, we tackled some really, really tough projects across the city. So we won't back off from them, but it does require, we have to really be ready to pay all the costs involved. And they certainly are often very political if we have to do lane reductions and parking reductions. So Phil, I think you're probably best positioned for this one.
Okay, so again, this is the traffic signal timing. So what we do is, especially when you got closely spaced intersections along major arterial roads, we want them to be coordinated with one another so that vehicles aren't stopping at every light. Because if that occurs, then we tend to get people either speeding or running through red lights because they get frustrated. So we do have a traffic system. We do talk to all our over 1,200 traffic signals in real time, and we able to change the timing. What we do at some intersections is we release it from what we call coordination, so that the demand's a lot quicker, and we'll do that at some intersections, depending on the time of day and things like that. In terms of, it says all traffic lights should be programmed to provide full duration green cycles. So I'm assuming that means having the traffic signals cycle all the time, even though there may not be pedestrian, cyclists, or traffic on the side street. We tend to operate those, and you'll see that a lot downtown where there's traffic or pedestrians or cyclists in both directions, and it's about the same. Out in the suburbs, unless you're at one of those, two arterials meeting at the intersection, so like Terry Fox and Hazeldean, or intersections like that, we tend to have the traffic signals only triggered if there's demand, because again, we actually get a lot of complaints because we have detectors on the side street, and if one of those break down and they cycle continuously, we'll get a lot of calls from people saying there's no one there and the lights aren't changing. So in terms of the red revert, we are putting in a new feature that'll be installed later this spring in all our traffic signals. One of the good things with the traffic signals is that the system's been programmed internally, so it's not a matter of going out and putting a new chip in the computer that runs the traffic lights. We could do it through software, so these can be implemented quite quickly. And what it'll do is, if a cyclist or a vehicle arrives and the lights and it goes from amber to red and there's still demand, the light will stay red and then it'll go green for that. Because the issue with red revert is, and the intent of that is, if there's no longer detection on the side street, then the demand goes away and the light doesn't cycle. But the chance is the cyclists that want to get a little head start, so they tend to, or some tend to go when the light's still red, and then they lose that detection, and then the light all of a sudden goes back green for the main street, which could be very problematic for the cyclists, and from a safety perspective, and all just from a cyclist feeling of comfort. So we had to make a change to our software, and that's almost done now. We're doing the testing right now, and we would be rolling those out. So we'd see those at like MUPs, intersections where there's high cycling volumes, and things like that. If we have an intersection that's running fixed time, or at the big intersections where there's always demand, like at the two arterials meeting, you don't necessarily need to have that because the light's always cycling anyway. You won't have that drop. So that example of MUP and Holly Acres, that would be one of those locations where that would have that feature, so that if the cyclist is there at the end of the amber, they would then get the green display. So maybe on the next slide, because I think the next slide is tied to me as well as that.
This is Bob Van Leeuwen. I'm just going to interject here, because one of the things that occurs to me hearing this whole discussion is that cyclists seem to be at some points pedestrians because they have to ride on the sidewalk because the road's not safe. At other times, they're motor vehicles because you don't have a sidewalk or you prefer to be in traffic. And other times you're something else because you're on the side of the road. And I think the city could do themselves a favor if they could look at their streets and say, how many times are you asking the cyclist to change from being a pedestrian to being a motor vehicle to being something in between? Because when you're on the side of a road, you're not a motor vehicle as far as the motor vehicles are concerned. They can pass you at any time. If you're in the middle of the street, you are a motor vehicle, but now all the cars have to ride at your speed. If you're on the sidewalk, you're not a pedestrian, but you are one, except you're moving a lot faster than a pedestrian will. And as I said to our local counselor, I saw a horrible bike accident result with a young kid that was riding on the sidewalk, obviously got run over by a truck that was trying to get in between other vehicles turning left on Main Street in Stittsville. You need to look at cyclists and say, how am I going to class them through this whole experience? And every time I ask them to change what I think they are, pedestrian, cyclist, or motor vehicle, you are asking them to do something that is different. And when you ask them to do something that's different, the cars get confused, the cyclists get confused, and the pedestrians get confused. So you need to find a way to make your pathways treat the cyclists the same throughout the city.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob, for your comments. And I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do in terms of, you know, the measures and the features that Zlatko's talked about in terms of the protected intersections, the you know, the separate bicycle facilities. So it used to be, you know, if you think of Hunt Club, it was built in the 90s, and you got a bike lane right next to the traffic going 80 kilometers an hour. Well, things have evolved since that time in terms of we would never do that today. It would be done with a separate cycling facility, and that's in our plans now. But you know, unfortunately, we just can't snap our fingers and change everything overnight. It takes time, and I know I've seen some comments in terms of you know, missing links and things like that. I think there was an example of Dines and Fisher where I think the comment was you know, it's great you built the intersection, but there's nothing outside of there. But you know, when we have the ability to make reconstruction at intersections, because those are the ones that take time, we want to build it to what we'd want the standards to be. And it may be that a little further down the road, the links to those intersections will get built, but at least you've got something in place. We're doing that with developers as well on main streets. I know, like out on Beechwood, there's some cycling facilities that painted on road, but as the area gets redeveloped, they're building cycle tracks as part of that, so that hopefully in 5, 10, 15 years, when the road either gets rebuilt or the development gets looked at and completed, then you have the ability to create that environment, because ultimately that's where we want to be, but we just can't, like I said, do it overnight. So in terms of cycling, I mean, the designation of those is in the Highway Traffic Act. They're considered vehicles, and so we do have areas in the city, especially if there's short missing links, where we do permit them on sidewalks to get from point A to point B, because there's 2 cycling facilities at either end of that. So that's something that we can look at from that perspective. So anyway, so those are the kind of things that we're looking at doing, and it's a long-term thing. But I can say that as roads get rebuilt, and new facilities get built, that cycling facilities, sidewalks, they're all integrated in that, and we work very closely with our planning department to ensure that developers are also doing that on their streets. So Zach, may we go to the next slide? So this one here was about signal turns. So I wasn't sure if this was meant to be on the side street or on the main street. So if there's a left turn arrow that's at the intersection, so if this is you're on the main street like Hazeldean or Eagleson, there is a detector on the road, and it does detect bicycles. The detection is actually looks at metal, and a change in the when the metal, like of a car or a bicycle, goes on the detector, it does that. It sees that presence, and it would bring up the arrow. We do put yellow dots at the intersection, so you'll see those on the side street as well. And that's where the actual detector is embedded in the ground. So as a cyclist, that's where you would place yourself. We have the same thing at MUPS as well, in terms of where you see those yellow dots. If you have locations where you don't see those yellow dots, let us know. We do replace them once a year, but like with everything else, they do. It is just it's a piece of material that's glued on the ground. So we do that as well. I think there was also just looking at the. Yeah, so again, here, this was more the, I think the comment about if you miss the cycle in terms of a cyclist. So again, we recommend you stay on the detector. And like I said, if you can't see the detector, you don't see yellow dots, then let us know, and we'll get a crew to go out and put those on the ground, and then you would be able to get detected. Because a lot of times, and I see this with vehicles too, where especially where you got the wider intersections, the cycle lengths tend to be a little longer. So people wait there for a minute and they say, well, the light's not changed. They go press the push button, and then they see the light change. You wouldn't have to do that. The light would have changed anyway. It's just a longer cycle because we want to have the coordination. But in this case, that amber lock and the right turn of vehicles that go off the detectors will get fixed. So hopefully that answers the questions on that.
All right, well, thank you. I think a point I would like to end with is that if you want to keep track of the progress on the Transportation Master Plan, and that'll be going on for at least another couple of years, please do sign up to Engage Ottawa. My colleague Laura will be adding the link to the chat for both these. The second link is if you'd like to sign up to our Cycling in the City e-newsletter. The last issue went out recently, and we had over 20,000 subscribers across the city. So we send it out about 3 times a year, and we'll provide updates on projects. It's a big city, lots happening, so I'm sure you'll find new projects there that will be of interest. You may want to check them out. So thanks very much. So I'll hand it back, Councillor Gower, if you had any other next steps or comments.
Yeah, thank you, Zlatko. That was quite a bit of info and a lot of things answered. And I've been trying to watch the chat as it's been going by here as well. Lots of good feedback and discussion. We're at 7:34, and officially, I believe we're scheduled here to 8 p.m. So I know that each of us as councillors have been collecting feedback from our wards as well as watching the chat. And I just wanted to maybe just go around the councillor table and see if you wanted to ask anything to staff on behalf of residents, either things you've seen this evening or other general feedback you've received so far. Jenna, do you want to start? Maybe we'll go Jenna, Eli, Alan.
Sure, thanks, Glenn. And I too, I've been trying to follow along with the chat here on Zoom. And there's quite a few questions here, so we might be able to circle back if we have time, hopefully at the end. Myself, one thing that wasn't mentioned that maybe I'll just ask as part of this active transportation network, how are we looking at school zones? Is that part of the consideration through the active transportation plan, or is that a separate program that deals with our school zones?
Well, there are other programs that certainly deal with school zones, but it's one of the most important criteria that we include, particularly for sidewalks. And I think we've made a lot of progress in making sure that, I don't know if we're quite at 100%, I know we're not, but we've made a lot of progress in making sure that schools have good connectivity. Similarly, on cycling, when we look at 15-minute neighborhoods, there is schools are definitely on that list. And I might ask my colleague to maybe comment, Laura Hagerman. I think she had quite a bit of experience with school zones. Can you comment on that, Laura?
Yeah, this request has come up a number of times over the last couple of years, prioritizing sidewalks around schools and active transportation to and from school. So between the traffic department and transportation planning, we've identified schools that don't have a solid existing sidewalk infrastructure to and from the school. So those have been identified in the transportation master plan. And there's been some language included in the official plan update to make sure that they are prioritized moving forward.
Thanks, Laura. Also, I want to say that the design standards are improving dramatically. We're looking at raised side paths where sidewalks cross side roads, as well as much reduced crossing widths. at intersections and also this general move towards a 30-kilometer design standards. Phil, that's an important topic. I don't know if you perhaps had more to add.
Well, in terms of the 30-kilometer design standards, so through the Road Safety Action Plan that was approved by Council in 2019, one of the recommendations was that any new road that's built, any residential street that's built as any part of new development's got to be built to a 30-kilometer design, as well as any road that's rehabilitated in the city on a residential street would be designed to that. Because ultimately we want all our residential streets to be operating at 30 kilometers an hour. And unfortunately, it'd be great if we could just put a sign that says 30 and everybody would travel at that speed, but the reality is that doesn't happen. You need to have those, geometric features in place to create that environment where vehicles will drive at that speed. So it's a long process in terms from that perspective, but we do work very closely with the councillors. We do, they're given funds every year to install temporary traffic calming measures. So that could be speed boards, paint on the road, the flex stakes that you see, to create sort of friction and environment to try to get those speeds lower, especially on those residential streets. In terms of school zone safety, as Laura mentioned, and we are actively working with schools. We've got a coordinator, and that's their sole job, is to work with all 300 plus schools in the city to try to address any concerns that they have. As well as we're in the process of the automated speed enforcement pilot, which is focused on schools. So we're bringing back a report to committee later this year that's going to talk about the findings that we've seen, because we've had it in place since last July, to see what the impacts are, and a recommendation in terms of, do we expand this program from the 8 schools. So I think those are the kind of things that we're trying to do to ensure that the roads are safe, operate as safe as possible near the schools.
Excellent. Thank you for those responses. I think it's important to raise that. It hadn't come up yet in our discussion tonight, and I think it's an important consideration as well as we work on the active transportation plan. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe I'll pass it on to one of my colleagues, maybe Eli, if you'd like to take a turn.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you to staff for the presentation. When we talk about paving shoulders, I mean, we've done this, Phil, you and I, we've been around long enough. We've done the paving shoulder in the past, but when the shoulder was paved, not at the same way the road was paved, they didn't last very long between the snow plow, the garbage truck, the school buses. They were easy to fall apart, basically. And then really will create false expectation, because in one part they may be in good shape, the other part broken down, and force the cycles to go on the road. So is the plan because you remember, Phil, I did something out of my office budget for Old Carp Road, and now it looks the new pavement on Old Carp Road is a little bit higher than, so it's really didn't give a good. So basically, if we can avoid paving shoulders on its own, and we can do it at the same time when we do the road, like we did on Carp Road, Galata Side Road. Sorry about that. That's the beauty of working home, I guess. So is the future plan is to make sure when new road becomes resurfaced, rehabilitation, if we have the ability to make it a bicycle lane, we should pave those shoulders the same way we pave the road. Is that what I'm hearing?
Councillor, yes, that in fact in 2013, I think that was one big success as we ironed that out. And over the last years, it has worked very well. So the basic policy is that when a rural road is being repaved, if it's identified as a spine route in our plan, they will add a paved shoulder at the same time the road is resurfaced with the same quality material, as long as it's feasible. Sometimes the road base just isn't wide enough, but that doesn't happen terribly often. So I think it's been successful, and I'm familiar with just a couple of examples where we stitched on a paved shoulder, and we really don't like to do that for all the reasons you mentioned.
Okay. If I made another quick question, though, came from one of my residents, and he would like to see basically a better connection to the NCC cycle. And so if you are in Carp, what's your advice? Go to Carp Road, go to Richmond Side Road, and then to Terry Fox, where we have cycle, and then from there you can hook up to the NCC. Is that something feasible at this time?
Well, Councillor, maybe if in the chat or whatever, we can be very specific about the connection point. We do meet regularly with the NCC. And so, so certainly that's something we can have a look at and see what can be improved. If you consider that one example I had along Carling, a question we had about that rail bridge, that was a good example of where if we fix our problem, we can fix an NCC connectivity problem, which after all, for our residents, they don't care whose pathway it is. They just like to see these things solved. And I think that's the consistent message we give to the NCC is please help us with the interconnection of your network with ours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And just for the record of those people who's listening to us, the bridge you're talking about in Carlin Avenue, there's no longer used by the CN, correct? Is it unabandoned?
That's correct. That's correct.
So does it have to stay? Is that something we need to look at in the future?
Well, I think we'll look at all the options that are sort of available to us. And certainly, and I think Phil will agree that that's also been a concern for the vehicle traffic coming through there as well.
You're right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess we're going to Councillor Hubley.
Thank you, Councillor Alessandri. And thanks, staff, for the presentation tonight. I very much appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for also joining with us tonight. I did see somebody on there earlier. Is Bill Hitchcock still on there?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. If nobody sees him, then I'm not going to say anything for him.
Yep. Councillor, he's here. Bill's here.
There he is. Okay, Bill. Hi. I just want to give you a shout out for the work that you do along the pathways by the Carp Bridge and everything. It's I get a lot of mentions from residents appreciating the work that you're doing down there. So thank you. I want to give you a shout out. Thanks. The other thing I want to mention here in the discussion tonight, we've had a lot of back and forth with staff about individual links around the area. I know Councillor Gower and I do a lot of stuff talking about how we're going to link pathways in Canada south to Stittsville, for example. But one of the things we're going to need everybody's support to make it happen is the pathway network in Canada and Stittsville was basically the sidewalk network that was built into the community. Often, for example, in Canada South, you can get to Stittsville faster on a pathway than you can by getting in a car and driving over there, which is what promotes cycling and walking. So what we have to do is we have to get the city plans, such as this one here that's being updated, to recognize those pathways as sidewalks, so that when federal funding comes available for sidewalks, we can get some money into not just fixing up the pathways that are breaking up and everything, but ideally I'd like to see many of them widen to a MUP network so that cyclists can use them instead of having to deal with the issues of dealing with traffic, but also have a quicker way to get to where they're going. So that's something I would ask all of you to be aware of, and I believe my councillor colleagues all support the effort to try to get more money into renewing these pathways. So thank you very much, Councillor Gower. That's all I'll add for now.
Thanks, Alan. So I have three quick things. First of all, on Stittsville Main Street, because there were some questions in the chat. I'll say stay tuned. Coming soon, we're going to be sharing with residents a public realm plan that we're working on for Stittsville Main Street, which is going to allow us to build out some detailed design and start looking at the scope and the budget for doing some upgrades to the roads, including sidewalks and bike facilities if we can. And once we have that, it'll mean we'll be eligible to get funding from the city and even from the province and the federal government when it becomes available. So I'll be sharing that in the next few weeks. We just had a update on that yesterday, our first look at the scope of what we're working on. Second thing, the number one piece of feedback we've had from Stittsville residents is, in terms of missing links, is the link from Stittsville and Canada South across the Queensway to West Carleton and to Canada North. So I was wondering if staff could just tell us what is currently in the plans, even if it's long term, what kind of pedestrian or cycling links are there currently planned to get across the Queensway safely?
I think we're really limited in terms of what's new in terms of new crossing facilities in Canada. The cycle for significant rehabilitation of these structures is about 75 years. So we are starting to see, for example, in the West End, going as far as the Richmond Road crossing of the 417, and the next three interchanges are up for reconstruction starting between 2023 and 25. We have worked hard with the MTO to add active transportation protected facilities across there, and we will keep doing that as every opportunity arises. So I think that there's not a specific project that I can foresee, but I think we're open. Obviously, those kinds of crossings are super expensive, but if there's some clear plan for the future, we'd like to at least identify it, make it visible, and do some background work. And so, let's have that discussion and at least show what it can achieve. And in the last few years, we've built more overpasses in terms of bike ped than we have in the 2 decades before that. But nevertheless, it's still going to be a number measured in 1, 2, 3 for over 10 years.
So if a bridge over or a tunnel under the Queensway were to be built, would that be the city's responsibility or the province's or combination? Like, are there any rules around how that can be funded or who would be responsible for that?
There was a potential of a change in that policy in the last Liberal government. There was that absolute discussion about the responsibility of active transportation crossings going to the MTO. Currently, we've reverted to what used to be the policy where the MTO is definitely supportive of, for example, adding active transportation on existing overpasses, but they require the city to pay the incremental cost. So I think we've made progress on design. There's a positive attitude, but still we need to contribute. That's the current situation policy-wise.
Okay, and thank you. The third thing I wanted to ask was just from the chat earlier, when you were showing examples of the before and after of intersections. I think you had one in particular at Donald Street in the east end of Ottawa. Can you give us a sense of how much it costs to upgrade an intersection like that, and like how many of those does the city typically do per year?
Well, I think maybe Phil has a better idea. I think the number is ramping up dramatically just because we do things like major transit corridors, stage 2, rebuilds, and so on. So the number, I think, is actually probably significant. In terms of cost, we're seeing for the larger intersections that are protected, somewhere between 1 and 2 million. So they're extremely expensive. Phil, perhaps you can add some commentary on maybe your sense of the numbers.
Yeah, I think, if it's a standalone project where it's not a reconstruction of the road, you're talking $1 to $2 million, depending on how big the intersection is. I know like the Donald Saint Laurent intersection that was done a few years ago. I believe that was about 1.5 million, but that also included some transit priorities. So what we try to do, because our programs are fairly small in terms of budget, we try to add, if there's a pedestrian improvement, we can look at some pedestrian funding, cycling funding, transit funding to give us a bigger pot of money to make the improvements. So ultimately, I mean, the goal would be to rebuild all these roads and intersections when they get reconstructed, because the incremental cost is very low because the road's already getting ripped up. So to put it back with different curb lines and things like that is not a huge cost for the most part. It's when you look at, there's no planned construction that you're actually going into to rehabilitate that intersection. So we brought a report back to Transportation Committee last fall. It looked at high volume intersections and conflicts with cyclists and traffic. And we identified, I think there was just over 70 intersections identified. The good news of that is that about 60%, so about 40 of those locations were already in work plans to be done. So we looked at 30 intersections that weren't on any plans, and the cost estimate to do those 30 intersections was in the range of $30 to $35 million. And that was without buying any property and things like that. So again, it just depends on that. So we are, through the Road Safety Action Plan, starting to work on some detailed design of some intersections. And the goal right now is to get more of these designs completed so that we can hopefully, we're hearing that the federal government and even the provincial government will be providing some stimulus funding once COVID is done, that we've got design ready projects, because they always look for those type of projects, so that if we can get 4 or 5 or 6 intersections in the books ready to go, similar with our traffic control signal program, there we've got a funding gap of about $40 to $50 million. We've got 25 warranted locations, and those can cost anywhere between 3 and 4 million, especially in the outside the urban area where you got to put left turn lanes. So we're focusing on designs over the next year or two, so that hopefully we can get the funds to actually build, because the reality is the city. I mean, there's lots of priorities, and we only have a certain amount of money, so we really need the feds to come up. And when you look at road safety, and where you hear of the Netherlands and also Sweden, where it comes federally in terms of the emphasis, and they push money down to the municipalities. So that helps a lot. Now, that being said, as I mentioned earlier, we do have the automated speed enforcement program. We have the red light camera program, and when we brought forward our road safety action plan, council also approved that any funds that are generated from the revenue from people getting speeding tickets would go back to road safety. So in this past year's budget, we had $4 million approved. And so if council does recommend expanding the program, that number would potentially grow. And again, it's going to be any revenue that we do get will go right back to road safety. Because I know we do get concerns from people that you're just getting revenue to fill the coffers. But in this case, I mean, frankly, I'd be happy if we were getting no revenue, because it means no one was speeding and the roads would be as safe as possible. But the reality, that doesn't happen, especially near schools. But at least that revenue that does come back in will get focused on road safety, and we are using those funds to both in the rural areas, because one of the emphasis areas is, we see a lot of fatalities in rural areas just because of the higher speeds and things like that. So money is being put in from that perspective, as well as near schools and for pedestrians and cyclists.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Yeah, I noticed, or I've heard down in the US, some of the states are starting to look at their highway budgets, where they spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars per year, and starting to earmark, just a fraction of that highway budget towards sidewalk projects or pathway projects. And it'd be great to see the province do a similar thing. 1% of $1 billion is a substantial investment if that can be flowed down to municipalities, because it gives us more flexibility in the budget we have. But we're coming up on our 8 p.m. So I just want to give each of my council colleagues a chance to do a quick wrap up before we end tonight. I'll just go by ward number. So we'll go Jenna, Eli, and Alan again. Jenna?
Perfect. Thank you, Glenn. I just would like to thank everyone for participating. I'd also encourage you, as you go away from this discussion tonight, to reach out with, if there were issues that we didn't get a chance to touch on, priorities that you see that you'd like to share. Please do reach out. I don't want to speak for all my colleagues, but I'll speak for them. I know we want to hear from you. We want to hear those priorities. So don't hesitate to reach out as well. I know the Engage Ottawa site is another great way to engage on this. It is important that we get this right. We're making decisions now that will impact what the pedestrian and cycling infrastructure will look like out to 2034. So these are big decisions, and we need your input to make sure we do this properly. And my thanks, of course, to staff as well for tonight, but also, of course, for the good work that you're doing on this plan. And I'll leave it at that. So I guess I would pass over to Councillor Elshantiri.
Thank you, Councillor Sudds, and really just like to echo your comment to our staff. Thank you for your presentation and your time tonight. This is a good work and good start for all of us to work together. And I want to give shout to our residents who we heard from, whether direct mail or tonight attending the meeting and sending their questionnaire through the chat. And thanks to you, Councillor Gower, for helping organizing the Zoom and the new wave meeting these days. So thank you all. Councillor Hubley.
Thanks. I'm going to be very brief. I've already said the remarks that I want to say, so it's just a thanks to everybody for being out here again, and thanks to Glenn for organizing.
Thanks, Alan. So I will say, just in terms of next steps, there's been a very lively chat. So we are going to be providing a copy of this to staff for their reference, and maybe we'll see if we can publish it somewhere as well for the public. We have some note takers who've been taking notes throughout, and if there's some outstanding questions, we'll try to get an answer back to you. Please continue to send your counselor any feedback, and as Councillor Sudds mentioned, check out engage.ottawa.ca for the active transportation plan, the transportation master plan, and a lot of other feedback opportunities. It's really important that people get involved and share their opinion. The more response that staff gets from folks in the West End, I've learned that the squeaky wheel effect is in full force at City Hall. So it's really important that they hear about important projects in the West End of Ottawa, not just downtown, not just the East End, not just Barrhaven. Thank you to Zlatko and Laura and Sam and Phil for your help tonight. And thank you as well to all the folks behind the scenes in our counselors' offices who helped pull tonight's event together. And I hope everybody has a good night. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.